Hello, dear class. Here we are again in our weekly rendezvous with Latin American Civilization, LEH 2020. I'm Joseph Holbrook, your professor of Latin American history. And today we're going to talk about the new nations of Latin America, in particular the context of their wars of independence against Spain, and in the case of Brazil, not a war, but independence from Portugal. This comes from Martin and Wasserman's Chapter 8, Latin America and its Peoples. Creoles and the descendants of the Spaniards were surrounded by large populations of Indians, Africans, and mestizos, particularly in some areas where there was a former Indian empire, such as central Mexico and the highlands of Peru. This was one reason that the Spanish Empire lasted so long, nearly 300 years, because the upper-class whites, often the Creoles, who were white Europeans but born in the Americas, were terrified that any act of rebellion against the mother country might unleash popular unrest that could easily turn against them. In Peru, in particular, they had traumatic memories of Tupac Amaru II in the 1780s and a 2-year rebellion that took an immense toll. When the external events did bring the rupture between the mother countries and the colonies, the lower classes finally did join the fight. However, they didn't always join on the side of independence. Many times the indigenous people had trusted the father king of Spain more than they trusted the local Creole elites. They had their own agendas in mind when they fought. Africans wanted the abolition of slavery. The Indians wanted to end the special taxes on Indians. Many mestizos and Indians wanted land reform. Some Indians and slaves fought for the king, others for independence. The movements for Latin American independence divided on the lines of geography. Peruvians and Venezuelans and Argentines all distrusted one another. Even within places like Argentina, the various states or parts of Argentina distrusted one another, and the same was true of La Gran Colombia. The people in the rural provinces distrusted the upper classes living in the capital cities. There were divisions along racial, social, and economic lines, as well as geographical, which shaped Latin American policies for much of the 19th century. This was also during the Age of Revolutions, which began around 1776 with the successful uprising of British colonists in the 13 colonies of the coast of North America against Great Britain. In 1789, the French Revolution took place, spreading the ideas of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. In 1791, there was a successful uprising of African slaves in Haiti, the first successful slave revolution in history. The first two revolutions caused the upper-class Creoles to think about independence from Spain, but the last revolution caused them to hesitate. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, there was a political crisis in 1808. The energetic Charles III, who was the primary Bourbon reformer, died in 1788. His successor was a dim-witted Charles IV. From 1793 to 95, Charles IV allied himself with England against the French revolutionaries. After the revolutionary zeal faded and Napoleon took charge, he reverted to his former alliance with France. Big mistake. In 1808, France invaded Spain, or actually asked permission to pass through Spain on its way to invade Portugal, and then coerced Charles IV into abdicating his throne in favor of his son Ferdinand VII, who was forced off the throne by Napoleon and replaced by his brother Jose, or known as Pepe. So Europe was in an uproar, with the French invading through Spain and into Portugal in 1808. This was a major disruption. Spain, the Napoleonic invasion and representative government from 1808 to 1814, the French troops passed through Spain on their way to invade Portugal, which was a traditional ally of Great Britain. Spain experienced considerable political turmoil. Charles IV was not popular. His Prime Minister Godoy was rumored to be sleeping with his wife, and Spaniards lost respect for him, thinking that was true. Nevertheless, the Spaniards resented the intervention of the French, and this was the beginning of an increase in a sense of Spanish nationalism. So the Spaniards rose to fight against the invading French. Creoles, that is, the elites that were born in the Americas, feared that the French armies might overwhelm all Spanish resistance and then take authority over the Americas. The Spanish people rose up and resisted. They claimed that sovereignty lay with the people. They organized themselves into a guerrilla war, guerrilla being a Spanish word that means a small war, or the hit-and-run war of people who were outgunned and outmanned. They experimented with forms of representative self-rule, such as the Cortes, which was an institution going back into the medieval period. Spanish Americans experienced self-rule for 6 years until the Napoleonic Wars ended and Ferdinand VII was able to regain his throne. By that time it was too late, even though Ferdinand VII did not realize it. The Spanish Cortes and the Constitution. The Spanish organized local juntas to replace the monarch. The central junta was called the Cortes, a parliamentary body that existed during medieval times and had not met for 3 centuries. The organizers invited American representatives to send people to the central junta and participate in deliberations, and the Cortes met in Cadiz in September 1810. The Americans feared that the French might overwhelm Spanish and seek to impose its rule on the Americas, so the Junta of Venezuela declared its independence from Spain in July 1811. This is Spain under José Bonaparte. Others cooperated with the Spanish Cortes. Hundreds of cities held elections for elected municipal councils, or cabildos. The Constitution of 808 was a very liberal constitution. The most important change was that the Cortes of Cadiz implemented was the writing of a constitution in 1812, which limited the powers of the monarchy. They intended to do away with the absolute monarchy. Self-governing juntas likewise sprung up in the Spanish Americas. But the pernicious question was the so-called American question. There were disruptions to the rule of the monarchy. The first objections came at this time to the American autonomy. Spaniards prevailed on the question of representation and the Spanish mercantilist monopoly, while Americans wanted free trade. Americans who initially favored cooperation with the new government moved towards greater self-determination. The dilemma of the American question was, how were the Spaniards to allow Americans to participate? Of course, when we say Americans, we're talking about Spanish Americans. And how were they to elect their representatives? If it was based on population, would that include Native Americans? Would it include slaves? In such case, the number of American representatives to the Cortes would completely overwhelm the Spanish representatives. And so this was the thorny problem of the American question. Meanwhile, back over in the Americas, particularly in Venezuela, Mexico, and Argentina, we had the emergence of a number of leaders of the wars of independence. Perhaps the most well-known was Simón Bolívar, who was quoted as saying, "The habit of obedience has been severed." In Chile, we had a descendant of Irish Catholics. I mentioned a few weeks ago Ambrosio O'Higgins. His son was Bernardo O'Higgins, who became a key leader in the wars of independence along with San Martin. He was from Chile. In Mexico, the catalyst was Padre Hidalgo, who was executed and later replaced by Padre Morelos, and a guerrilla fighter by the name of Vicente Guerrero. In Argentina, you had General José de San Martin, who had been an officer in the Spanish army. The Spanish-American grievances were many. Tensions had been growing for decades. There was great population growth, scarce land and water. There had been 150 village riots in central Mexico from 1700 to 1820. In the 1780s in Peru, we had Tupac Amaru II, who led a 2-year massive revolution or uprising against the authorities in Peru that was almost successful. The Bourbon reforms during this same period increased tensions with the local people. Also, Spain expelled the Jesuit order from the Spanish domains in 1767, which caused riots in Mexico City. In 1808, there was a disruption of the monarchy when Napoleon invaded through Spain. That was the match that sparked the conflagration that changed the world. So in Mexico, in particular, we had unrest in Bajío, 200 miles northwest of Mexico City. People were working in cloth factories, and artisans who made textiles had lost their livelihoods when reforms opened them to free trade. Bajío's silver mines had declined. In 1785, 15% of the population died of hunger, and again in 1809 there was hunger. Padre Hidalgo's forces sacked towns and killed Spaniards, men, women, and children. Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla was a priest in Dolores, Mexico, in the region of the Bajío. He was born in 1753 in a middle-class Creole family. He had been educated by the Jesuits. He read books on the French Enlightenment. He narrowly escaped from being inquired about in the Inquisition. I can't remember the word, I just went blank, but to be interviewed by the Inquisition. He had a small farm that was taken from him for back taxes. He tried to develop industry to help his parishioners, but to no avail because of the Spanish economic system. El Grito de Dolores happened in September 16, 1810. Authorities in Mexico City were conservative and attempted to maintain ties with Spain at all costs. Hidalgo was involved in a plot to overthrow them. He decided when he knew he was going to be discovered on a preemptive strike, and gathered thousands of his supporters. In a very short time after his grito, he had 60,000 supporters in an army. Half of them were Indians, 20% were mestizos, and the rest were Creoles. They were driven by hunger and desperation. Hidalgo's forces sacked several towns and killed hundreds of Spanish men, women, and children who had taken refuge in the municipal grain warehouse in Guanajuato. They captured and executed Hidalgo, but another priest, Jose Maria Morelos, continued the fight, controlling southern Mexico from 1811 till his defeat in 1815. After that, the mestizo Vicente Guerrero continued the guerrilla warfare. In Venezuela, you had Creole upper-class men in Caracas who began efforts to create a self-governing junta in 1808, but succeeded only by the spring of 1810 when they overthrew the Audiencia and the Spanish governor. Simón Bolívar took command of the forces favoring independence in 1813, but was defeated by royalist armies led by a Venezuelan vaquero or cowboy from Los Llanos, the plains area of Venezuela, named Jose Tomás Boves, who led an armed cavalry of mulatto and mestizo cowboys, and they defeated Bolívar and forced his exile. Bolívar went into exile. He had been in Paris as a young man and had witnessed the coronation of Napoleon as an emperor, and this flavored his political career because he always fancied himself the Napoleon of the New World. He was making progress in defeating the pro-Spanish factions in his Admirable campaign in Venezuela from 1813 to 14, and he decreed a war to the death against Spaniards, and that's the time that he became known as El Liberator. In 1815, he was defeated, as I mentioned before, by Boves and an army of mulatto cowboys. He fled to Jamaica and then later to Haiti for help. Argentina and the crisis of 1808. And I believe I'm going to stop here and continue with a part 2. And we'll talk about Argentina, and then we'll talk some about Brazil and the eventual independence of the Americas. Thank you. Have a good week. Please read the chapter.